Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, I like your voice. I'm not sure where the expression came from, but I have a problem. There were about 8 people at the lecture on our.
Good afternoon, everybody. Let's get started. Let's get started. Thank you for coming. For people on Zoom, you are muted. Please stay muted. Be greatly appreciated. People in the room, if you have a cell phone, if you could please silence it, that would be greatly appreciated so it doesn't go off in our presentation. Roy Hunt is here to introduce our speaker.
Well, what a great crowd. And you're in for a great treat. Um, I want to take about 3 minutes to before I actually introduced Claire. My guess is that most of you have visited Notre Dame at one time or another, perhaps many times. Uh, but did you realize when you were visiting that the building was very much a product of the 19th century? Between 1844 and 1864, and by an architect named Viollet-Le-Duc, who is really the father of historic preservation uh, in the whole world. Uh, and the iconic spire, which you saw come down on television, was all Leduc, Viollet-Le-Duc. A wooden one that existed earlier had fallen down or fallen off, I would say at least 100 years earlier. Well, my first visit to Paris and to Notre Dame was in 1952, and historic preservation was simply not in my vocabulary. I was 18 at the time. Um, 3 years earlier, our Congress had chartered the National Trust for Historic Preservation, but this was not the type of subject that was discussed in Humboldt, Tennessee, where I grew up. Uh, and I still knew nothing about it. And then in 1966, Congress passed the National Historic Preservation Act, among other things, creating the National Register of Historic Places. The same year, the National Highway Transportation Act was passed, and there are hugely important provisions in there in terms of saving historic buildings that used to be torn down for building interstates. In 1969, the National Environmental Policy Act was enacted. So that triad of federal legislation laid the groundwork for historic preservation in the United States. Well, in 1976, I began teaching historic preservation law at the University of Florida, and at the time it was still an esoteric field. Maybe it still is. But I soon learned that Viollet-Le-Duc and the ongoing controversy about his restorations, including that of Notre Dame, was the primary thing you had to look at if you wanted to look at the roots of historic preservation. The controversy resulted because of his prioritizing of a romanticized, unified vision of a building's past over preserving its authentic historical fabric. This was addressed head on by our Congress, not by Congress really, but by the Secretary of the Interior, because in 1978, something called the Secretary of the Interior Standards and Guidelines for treatment of historic properties was introduced. It's been modified a number of times, but it emphasizes authenticity. And today, Claire is going to give us or tell us about the restoration of Violet's 19th century restoration of Notre Dame. I think she may mention some other projects as well, but that's the one that's important to us. So let me tell you a lot about Claire, whom I've known for quite a while through a mutual friend who was president of the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Claire joined the UF College of Law in 2011 as Associate Dean and Legal Information Head, and also as the Clarence T. Sell Professor of Law. When I first came here, he had just recently died, but that's 60-something years ago. And nobody remembers Claire T. Sell except for Claire's occupying the chair. She served as director of the 2016 law program that we had that was split between Paris and Montpellier. Her previous experience includes positions at Cornell Law School. She came to us direct from Cornell, and Duke University School of Law, a fellowship at the Max Planck Institute in Hamburg, and she's taught in France, Spain, and Poland. She's a specialist in legal research and has published several books and numerous articles, including Germain's Transnational Law Research, which received the 1992 Joseph L. Andrews Award. Her scholarship focuses on comparative law, French law, and global legal research. And some of her recent book chapters and articles were on the UN Convention on International Sales, the French criminal jury uh, digitizing laws, authentication of official documents, and legal information management in a global and digital world. Her article on approaches to statutory interpretation and legislative history in France has been included in two comparative law case books. And case books are what burden all law students. Professor Germain received the Chevalier, or the Knight of the French Legion of Honor, in 2007 for her work in bridging the U.S. and French legal culture. And I have to say that that organization is headquartered in the old Hotel de Somme, which was under construction when Thomas Jefferson was in Paris for 5 years. And in the late afternoons, he would go and rent a chair in the Tuileries and watch that building going up. So when he got back to Virginia, he tore down the first version of Monticello and built what you see today. So that's where her group is headquartered. Well, from 2009 to 2015, she served as chair of the section on libraries and the International Federation of Library Associations. And in 2006, 7 was president of the American Association of Law Libraries. She's been a consultant to various organizations, including the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And again, that's how I got to know her, through the president of that court. She was an invited participant to a program, Access to Foreign Law Project, Joint Conference of the European Commission and the Hague Conference on the Private International Law in Brussels in 2012. In 2013, she was elected to the International Academy of Comparative Law, and she's fluent in French, English, and German. Not included in this long introduction I was given is the fact that she's a fantastic French chef. And some of you were here when she talked about Carcassonne and Cassoulet. We are very fortunate that she and her husband, Stuart Basescu, who's sitting here in the front row, faithfully recording this, that they chose to make Oak Hammock their home instead of returning to the south of France. Claire.
Well, Roy, thank you very much for that long introduction. You always elevate everything. You stole the fire from me a little bit about the spire, because I was going to talk about the spire. But you can see here the flames, that the spire is somewhere here. And one thing to note when the flames came is that the Notre Dame was in scaffolds. They were doing work at the time, so it was even worse. So today I'm going to share with you my experience of Notre Dame, Notre Dame, or Our Lady of Paris. Yes. So I've known Notre Dame since I was a child, but I've learned a lot recently by doing the research for this presentation. I don't know what you were doing on April 15th, 2019. I was at home doing some work on my computer, and all of a sudden, I see a news item, Notre Dame brûle, Notre Dame en flamme, Notre Dame is burning, it's in flames. So it was so, I couldn't believe it. It was so horrible to think about, that Notre Dame, that everybody took for granted, was maybe about to be demolished by the flames. So you see the Eiffel Tower, the famous spire of Viollet-Le-Duc. So what happened that evening, it was about 2 o'clock here, Gainesville time. It was about 7 o'clock in Paris. So the time where people get out of work. Thousands of Parisians and people from other parts of France, tourists, gathered around Notre Dame. Many of them were crying, many were praying. The firefighters came pretty quickly and extinguished the fire. It took them 5 hours, and then it took even 4 more hours, 9 hours as a whole, to extinguish all that was burning. The same evening, the President of the Republic, Emmanuel Macron, said, "Don't despair, we're going to reconstruct, we're going to rebuild, and it will be done within 5 years." Nobody believed him. I mean, you can see the shape of things. Things were horrible, in a horrible shape. So what I will talk about today is the fire. What did it take to reopen it just 5 years after the fire? Then a little bit of history, what happened between the founding, which was in 1163, and today. In particular, the central role of Viollet-Le-Duc in the 19th century. And then finally, or maybe throughout, why does everyone like Notre Dame? Why is everybody attached, whether you're Catholic or believer or not? So Notre Dame, first and foremost, is a sanctuary. It's a place for pilgrims, for the faithful. They say 5 masses every day, 7 on Sunday. So it's a very important part of what Notre Dame is. And it was built on top of an older church because it's on the Ile de la Cité, which is a very old part of Paris. It's an iconic landmark. It's visited before the fire. It was visited, the most visited monument of Paris, in part because it's free access. So when you go to the Eiffel Tower, you pay a lot of money, but the Catholic priest in Paris decided that no one should have to pay to enter the church. So you have long lines, but you don't pay. So about 13 million people every year, about 30,000 every day. And I took most of the pictures, you know, not those, but this one and many others, because I felt that I needed to see Notre Dame again to be able to tell you more about it. So we went in June, and we didn't have any tickets. So you can get tickets, but they're limited. So we stood in line for about an hour, but you know, like everybody else, and it works out, it goes on. It's part of Paris' identity. It's associated with Paris as one of the major monuments. Part of the political and literary history. Napoleon was crowned there by the Pope in 1804. It's the place where important ceremonies happen, like the liberation of Paris in 1944. The bells rang, there was a big ceremony. And then more recently, you remember on the opening day in December, all the politicians were there. President Trump, you remember the shaking of hands between Presidents Trump and Zelensky in the church. And it's a beloved monument. You can see all the cartoons after the fire. People express their emotions. You see Quasimodo, the bell ringer, the Hunchback of Notre Dame crying. You can see the chimeras. In French, it's chimère, so I hope it's chimeras in English, crying over the spire. We all know, you all know, I'm going to get the other one here. So Paris is here. Last time we talked about Carcassonne in the southwest. So when you get closer to Paris, you see the Paris itself, intramuros. The Basilique Saint-Denis deserves a note because nobody goes there. That's where all the, maybe except for Roy, it's actually where all the kings have been buried since Clovis. But right now it's not in a very fashionable area. So you have the cathedral, which is smack in the middle, the Eiffel Tower, the Sacré-Cœur de Montmartre. So it's very central. And I just wanted to show you how we go. Like, I grew up in Paris, and we lived right here. So we would go to the Garden of Plants a lot. You have the Seine, but we would go to Notre Dame. It takes about 20 minutes. So you go here, you cross, this is this part, it's a marina, the Canal Saint-Martin, you've heard about it. The Place de la Bastille is here. So you go here, then you go through the Ile de la Cité, no, excuse me, Ile Saint-Louis, and then you finally get to Notre Dame. It takes about 20 minutes. So we had an apartment with Stuart for about 20 years when I was teaching there. So when we got to it, this is from, the pictures are from June. We were surprised to see a big crane and scaffolding. So they fixed the front for the opening, but there's still a lot of work to be done. So that was interesting. Now you get to the Ile de la Cité, so you have a nice view here. And I did a lot of work in the French Supreme Court, that's the Cour de Cassation, and that's the Palais de Justice here. So that's the Ile de la Cité, the foundation of Paris, and then our beautiful church. You may have heard the expression, all roads lead to Rome, but not in Paris. In Paris, all roads lead to Notre Dame. So if you want to know the kilometers between Paris and Carcassonne, it starts from Notre Dame. So it goes back to Louis XV in the 18th century, and there was a law in 1924. And there is a plaque that tells you that in front of Notre Dame. What happened on that horrible evening? The cathedral is made of wood, limestone, lead, iron, and unfortunately, there were scaffolding, as you can see here. So it melted. I think that's where the spire was. So the whole ceiling fell through, and everything, of course, fell inside. So it was a huge catastrophe. Just a little diagram on what the cathedral, the different parts of the cathedral. It's the traditional Gothic design, which is a cross, Latin cross layout. So it has a long nave, an apse, and then the towers, the spire. So it's one of the largest cathedrals in Europe, and it started in the 12th century, 1163, and it's like Gothic art is an evolution of Roman art. So, and it's a specificity of French architecture. And then it became first primitive Gothic, then radiant Gothic. And that's the Cathedral of Paris is an example of that. The two towers were built in the 13th century. So what was affected were the roofs, the spire, part of the transept, luckily not the tower, and luckily not the rose windows. And they were able to preserve the artwork before the complete extinction of the flames. This gives you an idea of the choir. I told you everything fell inside. So there was a lot of crud, a lot of soot, bad fumes. People around were worried about the pollution. And here we are in the altar part. And so you can see the distinction. We're going to see him again, but this is Louis XIII and Louis XIV. And then this is a Pietà. We'll talk about that just in a second. This is one of my favorite pictures because what happened when they rebuilt Notre Dame, they not only fixed things, but they cleaned everything. And it's like day and night almost. So you can see the beautiful, they had to take a huge amount of limestone to match the color of what's called the white Parisian stone. And they are in local quarries. Now, look how tall the ceiling is. these vaulted ceilings, part of Gothic architecture, they show height, lightness, and they draw your eyes upward toward heaven. Rebuilding the roof was a big undertaking. You know, they call it the forest. The roof is 100 meters long, 328 feet. So they had to figure out where to get the timber pieces. So they had a list that had been drawn by Viollet-Le-Duc. So they had to go into the forest to find those. And they found 1,200 oak trees. And then, so they felled them, and then they replaced them with new trees. This gives you an idea of the amount of work necessary to repair this roof. They had to stabilize the structure, and that took 2 years. There were some 2,000 craftspeople, about 250 companies. We're going to talk a little bit later about the cost, but just for you to know, globally, some 900 million. It reopened on December 7th, 2024, only 5 years since the fire, but restoration is continuing. You see some other pictures, and then we will talk throughout, we will look at some of the artifacts and new items. Just briefly, a little history. Notre Dame the first stones were put in 1163 at the request of Bishop Maurice de Sully, who had a lot of money and space because it was very busy at the time. It lasted about 2 centuries. I'm going to go pretty quickly on the history. Now, what happened from the Middle Ages on, at the Renaissance people, they disdained the Gothic art. They thought it was primitive. So they started putting tapestries inside the church. In the 17th century, Louis the 13th made what's called, is right here, a pious wish to the Virgin Mary. He promised to build an altar to the Virgin Mary. He died before it was done, but his son, Louis XIV, did it. So you see that magnificent Pietà, which is more in the Baroque style, and it's done by Nicolas Coustou. So at that time, in the 18th century, they added flying buttresses, gables, and galleries. Then came really bad times for Notre Dame, because the revolution came, and the revolutionaries really hated the church because the third church was rich, didn't protect them, was very conservative, wanted to keep the royalty. So they barged into Notre Dame, they vandalized it, they made it into a wine warehouse, they forbade the practice of, you think it's funny to make it in the, well, maybe. They forbade the practice of religion, of Catholic religion. You had to glorify it became a temple of reason. So that replaced temple that replaced the Catholics. Also in the 18th century, the priest removed some of the stained glass windows that were so beautiful because they thought it made the place too dark, so to improve lighting. There was another kind of revolt in 1830. So after all of these events, the church was almost slated for demolition. You can see how pitiful it looks. But somebody came who saved Notre Dame from demolition. And one is a person that you've heard about, the famous writer Victor Hugo. Victor Hugo was asked to write a novel in the vein of Walter Scott that was called in French Notre Dame de Paris, in English The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And then he got together with Viollet-Le-Duc and other people like Prosper Mérimée, and they made a petition to save Notre Dame and restore it. And the government gave them money. So, as Roy alluded to, most of what the visitor sees today, even though it looks medieval and Gothic, it's actually the product of the imagination of Viollet-Le-Duc. And he modeled his chimeras after Daumier drawings. Daumier was a famous caricaturist, whatever, and also the person who did the drawings for the Hunchback of Notre Dame. Because those, I don't know if you probably have seen them, the chimeras, the gargoyles, they are like a fantastic beast, and they give rise to your imagination. It can symbolize the evil or the good. Quasimodo, the Hunchback of Notre Dame, would have conversations with this one, which is called in French, le strige. So, Viollet-Le-Duc made Notre Dame his playground, and he transformed the bulk of it into a neo-Gothic style. So he created these ornamental fantasies and disturbing gargoyles. And on the roof of the cathedral, there were 16 statues, and he put himself there. This is Viollet-Le-Duc in the form of Saint Thomas, who is one of the apostles, who is the patron of architects. Luckily, since the roof was under repair before the fire, they removed these 16 statues, copper statues, before. And that way they were protected and they didn't melt. So that was luck in a way. So the major renovations, he built the spire, he replaced damaged stones, he created a gallery of 100 statues. And you see those statues a little bit everywhere. Because, I'll explain something. Okay, he restored the cathedral portals and gallery of kings. So the portals, there are 3, they're right here. The gallery of kings is right here. He repaired the southern rose window and the sacristy, it's not that one. He inserted high windows like in the Middle Ages, and he came up with this idea of the gargoyles and the chimeras. And of course, there were controversies. That was controversial because it's the eternal conflict between historicism, leaving things the way they were at a particular period, and modernity. But of course, for Notre Dame in the 19th century, it was hard to figure out what time period it should be. And today, after the fire, it was also hard to know what time period. So in the restoration, you will see some modernity aspect too. Okay, the Gallery of Kings, something of interest here. So those are the kings. So those are the biblical kings of Judea. So all the lineage of kings before Christ. But the revolutionaries, they thought they were the kings of France. So what did they do? They destroyed them. And then they put the stones a little bit everywhere in Paris. And strangely enough, in 1977, during the construction done in an hôtel particulier, Rue de la Chaussée-d'Antin, which is near the opera, not at all near Notre Dame, somebody found all these heads. So those are the original heads. They found out of 28, maybe 21. So those are now displayed at the National Museum of the Middle Ages, which is the Cluny Museum, which is a really worth while seeing. It was recently renovated. And even more interesting, some of these retain traces of color, of polychromy, which means that some elements of the 13th century cathedral were painted. Because sometimes people say, why color? There was no color, but apparently there was color. Why were the heads there? So they don't know exactly. One theory is that somebody wanted to save them. Another theory is that they were reused, like many times stones from an old building are reused. That's what they did in Carcassonne. So they were used as support for something else. Okay, just to give you an idea of all the statues that Viollet-Le-Duc made. Actually, he made drawings and then he had the best sculptors sculpt them, but they are 19th century, they're not older. And the reason is that people at the time were illiterate. So it was didactic support. They tell stories. They show you the priest, stories about Jesus Christ, about the Virgin Mary, and you can read that. Okay, now another artifact which was of great interest to many people, it's the rooster. So the rooster is right up here, is right here. So that's the new one, that because it fell with the spire. So the rooster, it's a play on word. Gaul is the old name for France. Gaul is the same as Gallus, which is le coq. So it's the symbol of France. You see it on sportswear, le coq. It's a symbol of resilience and vigilance. And that particular cock, oh, and this one, and I took that picture, that's the one which is in the cathedral. That's the one that fell. So they couldn't put it back that way because it's quite banged up, but they kept it. So it contains 3 relics of the crown of thorns, Saint Denis, and Saint Geneviève, like tiny relics. Okay, and it's very symbolic for Christians. You remember Saint Thomas, who denied knowing the Christ, and he said the cock will sing, and the cock sing. Anybody knows that? Your Bible? Yeah, Mary knows. Mary knows, but I'm not sure about Bob. It's also used in France as a weather vane. Oh, so I don't know if you recognize that person. Probably not, but it's me when I was younger. I wanted to show you something about the chimeras right here, and then this one. At the time, they were clean because they must have done some, in France, there is so much pollution that you have to clean the facade of buildings, of your apartment buildings, and of monuments and buildings. So it must have been done maybe like late 60s, 70s. But you can see here that particular one, the same one, Le Strige, is kind of dirty. So those gargoyles and chimeras were popularized by Victor Hugo, invented or created by Viollet-Le-Duc. The Strige is this one. So there is a difference between gargoyles and chimeras. The gargoyle are water gutters, so they drain the water, but the chimeras are only ornamental. But yeah, so beast-like decorative. This is a famous photograph. I don't know if you ever saw it, taken by a photographer named Charles Nègre in 1844. Yeah, 1844. No, probably a little bit later, much later than that, probably toward the end of the 19th century. It's, yeah. So, okay. When you go up to the tower, you see that splendid view over Paris. And the towers are going to be reopened in September. They're not opened yet. So you see one of those animals, or, you know, this is Saint-Sulpice, Les Invalides, Eiffel Tower, and that's the left bank. There've been, of course, lots of movies, books, musicals, all kinds of derivative products around the Hunchback of Notre Dame. This is like Walt Disney, 1996, and then Max Ernst, the expressionist painter, did a rendition of one of these figures. Okay, so this is another artifact which is dear to many people is the Virgin and the Child at the pillar. So that Virgin was actually, she dates from the 14th century, and since 1818, she was in an abbey. And now since 1818, she is in Notre Dame. She's beautiful. She shows comfort, peace, hope. And a famous French writer and poet named Paul Claudel converted in front of her. He went there. It's very famous because after his conversion, he wrote lots of very well-known poems in honor of his Catholicism. You may not know Paul Claudel, but you may know about his older sister, Camille Claudel. She had a relationship with Rodin. She was the assistant, then they had a relationship, and then things went south. So it was saved during the fire and preserved in another church that you may know, Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois. But I love this Virgin, beautiful. Okay, the organ, if you like organs, it's big, it's tall, very tall. It has over 8,000 pipes, 115 stops. Didn't catch fire, but was damaged by the bad dust. And it's like a summary of the history of the French organ, because some pipes are from the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, and 21st century. And if I'm not mistaken, Bernadette, didn't an organist from Notre Dame came to Gainesville? Yeah, and a few years ago and played. So things happen in Gainesville. Something brand new in the restored Notre Dame. It's, how am I doing on time? 2:10. 5 more minutes. Okay, the return of color to the choir and many of the side chapels. And some people said, why color? But we now have discovered that there was color in the past. And this transforms Notre Dame. If you go back, you will be wild. It's just so beautiful. There is a new reliquary of cedar wood, and it contains the crown of thorns, believed to be the crown placed on Jesus Christ's head during his crucifixion. It was acquired by St. Louis, and he put it in the Sainte-Chapelle. He constructed the Sainte-Chapelle, and then it was moved for safekeeping to Notre Dame during the French Revolution. Okay, this is quite interesting also. I don't know how familiar you are with the notion of jubé. I think in English, wood screen, it's that part. It's a kind of wall that separates the choir, the stalls where the priests are, and the faithful. So it was removed in the 18th century, but they did excavation and they found all these fragments. So it's quite amazing. And those are preserved in the Cluny Museum. You can see how beautiful they are, and you can see the color also, and beautiful head of Jesus. And after doing research, they realized that there is the head of a virtue from Notre Dame Cathedral, which is in the National Museum at Duke University. And a virtue, you know what it is, faith, hope, charity. So it's kind of interesting. Now, it's a question for you. Which church in Paris still has a rod screen? Oh, I wish. I didn't do very well. Would you? It's one of the most beautiful churches. It's next to the Pantheon. I messed up here. So now we see modernity. The furniture is modern, all bronze. So you have the lectern, the altar, the chairs. And I think it's a beautiful contrast between the traditional and the new. And then you can see the Baroque Pietà at the end with the two kings. Now let's talk quickly about the liturgical clothes. They were designed, like in France, everything by a famous couturier, Jean-Jacques de Castelbajac, who is a fervent Catholic. And they're pretty colorful, as you will see here. So they've been the subject of some mockery, I'm afraid to say, because some people say it's like the Rubik cube or the Lego colors, but he says that they are symbolic value, you know, the sun, yeah, but anyway, so. Okay, so who does the cathedral belong to? Since the French Revolution, it belongs to the state. There was a law in 1905 that says that churches built before 1905 belong to the state. So the state gives money and then the church contributes. So you can see here President Macron, Emmanuel Macron, speaking within the church. But there are a lot of anti-clericals in France, so they don't like that idea. How much did it cost? So 900 million. Lots of. So American givers were very generous. 2/3 of international contributions from the US, 45,000 Americans, only 40% were Catholic. So there were big donations, small donations. And just wanted to make a plea for the US-French historical friendship. We've helped, I'm a dual citizen, so Louis XVI helped the American Revolution, mainly because he didn't like the British, so he wanted to fight the British. And after World War II, the US pumped billions into France to help rebuild the country and fight communism too. So those were win-win situations. And the art of stained glass window started in the 12th century. It's the hallmark of Gothic cathedrals. They used pigments from precious stones, like the blue from lapis. And it tells all kinds of stories that people could follow and read and tell each other, transmit with oral history. So there are 3 beautiful rose windows. And you see, they're designed in such a way for the light, so that the sunlight comes at different angles. So there's one that's more, this one is the original 13th century. This one is more red tones. That one had to be fixed in the 19th century. You can see close up. Controversy about Viollet-Le-Duc, what's called vitraux grisailles. You see, they are not figurative. They don't look that great. So there is a big controversy. By the way, this is a modern tapestry that was included, which is nice. There is a big controversy because the bishop, the archbishop, and President Macron decided that they were going to have modern stained glass windows. And the people complain, why change these windows that are okay? They're not, but they want to have contemporary windows. So this young woman Claire Tabouret is going to do them. So again, a controversy between modernity and tradition. There are two websites that I recommend to you. One is Notre Dame de Paris, the official website, English version, and the other is called the Friends of Notre Dame. It's a foundation, and you have all kinds of information on who gave money, why, about the various artifacts. I haven't talked about the bells, but there is so much to talk about. So I think I am done. And now I would like to hear not only your questions, but also your comments and your own experience with Notre Dame. Yes, I think.
A friend of mine said to me to ask you this question: what happened to the bees on Notre Dame's roof? Because they had an apiary on the roof.
Yes, I don't know to answer. I don't know. I don't know.
And then, do you have any clue as far as how the fire started?
Yes, that I forgot to mention. I think, well, maybe Stuart, you can check quickly the bees so that Dan knows. They think it might, they still have an inquiry about it. They still have an inquiry, but after so many years, they don't think it's a criminal origin. They think it's accidental, and it could be a cigarette butt, or it could be a short circuit. The complexity is because the place was under scaffold.
Yeah, because of this happens so often in the history of Gothic cathedrals to other cathedrals.
Yes.
The burning of them. I mean, that's
Yes.
one of the situations when you look at the history of cathedrals.
Yes. No.
Yeah.
Notre Dame, in a way, is lucky that it survived different wars. First World, because the Cathedral of Reims was severely destroyed during the Second World War. You want to check the bees?
Another question? Thought I saw a few hands up. Okay. Let me check online and see if there's any questions on there. No, no questions on there. Nobody has any other questions for Claire?
Well, let me, how to say, prompt people. I'm going to ask Anne Webster to tell us about her Notre Dame. She's over there.
Okay.
Right. Thank you. I can be real brief. I also did have a chance to go into Notre Dame after the restoration. It was in February and March. I think for me, when the question comes up, why is Notre Dame so beloved by so many people around the world, including people who aren't Catholics or aren't believers? There's so many reasons, but for me, it is its location in Paris, in the very center of the city, on that beautiful old island. And so every time that you're either walking along the quays on either the right bank or the left bank, or of course when you're crossing the river, as you do, because the central part of Paris is really fairly compact, and there's so much to see on both sides. Your eyes always go to Notre Dame. And I was lucky enough to have my first experience there at the age of 17 and many times since. So it's sort of an anchor of my feelings about Paris.
Thank you very much. I have an answer about the bees, and then you can go. Yes, the bees living on the roof of Notre Dame survived the fire. The 180,000 bees survived despite the intense heat and smoke due to their unique survival mechanisms and their location on the sacristy roof about 100 feet below the main roof where the fire spread. So, satisfied? Okay.
I just came back. I was there in early July in Notre Dame. And like Anne, I was a little older. I was 21 when I first visited Notre Dame. And it's very special. I came back with 3 books. One of them, a very large one, all about the reconstruction. So it's
Uh-huh.
a beautiful picture book. And another one which talked about the history of Notre Dame and how important it is to people. Much of what you said, it's a small paperback, very easy to read. And then another picture book is really gorgeous.
Claire, this outpouring of everyone feeling about Notre Dame, how did that relate to the funding of this? I mean, the contributions of Americans on the next day was quite an outpouring, I think, of feelings, not of
Yes,
commitment
yes.
to dollars or anything.
It was very emotional. I don't know exactly why, but maybe everybody feels they own a little part of Notre Dame. It touched their hearts. Yeah, the Americans were particularly generous, yes. And I read a story about people who give a lot of money and they're not Catholic. They're Americans, but they love Paris and they love Notre Dame. What I realized myself after seeing many capitals in the world, Paris, you don't have high rises in the city. You know, it's like you go from village to village. So it's very cozy. So that, like we walk from our home to Notre Dame, you can walk pretty much everywhere.
It's a rather technical question, but do you know anything about how they decided who was going to over uh, look over all this renovation work? How
Well,
did they go about,
yeah, well, I don't know what process there was, but you may remember there was a general who was in charge, George Jorcelin, something like that, and he died tragically by himself. He had an accident. So they had people from the army, they had some generals, the head was Philippe Jost. So I don't know if they went by the hierarchy. I'm sure the archbishop had something to say, the president. So, you know, you would have to do some research on that. I don't know. Roy.
It's coming here, just a sec.
A few years ago, probably 20, I was just sitting looking at the facade, and I was struck by the fact that the portals on the left and the right are slightly different.
Mm-hmm.
And I was surprised because they were all constructed at the same time. And then I read, and I guess this is true, that it was intentional because the architects thought that perfection in terms of balance was not the right thing to do because humans are not perfect.
Well, it's possible. And it's also true that the left tower is a bit thicker than they are not completely the same. It's a little wider than the right one, the left one. Yeah, I didn't comment too much, but to me, Notre Dame may not be perfect, but it's almost perfection because it's so harmonious. You know, you have cathedrals that are more flamboyant, Gothic, like Reims or Amiens, but I like Notre Dame because it's pretty simple in a way.
In World War II, my father was part of the liberation of Paris.
Uh-huh.
And my brother just recently sent me this wonderful photo of him standing there with an army buddy in his pipe looking absolutely thrilled. So that was very personal for me. And I felt great sympathy for people that I knew that Notre Dame meant so much to them, to see anyone go through such a loss. I lived in Ivory Coast, West Africa, and at that time, Houphouët-Boigny was the long-term president, and he had very close ties to France. And he built one of the largest cathedrals in the world in his hometown, I think in part as an homage to himself, but also to France. And I'm sure he wanted it to be even more elaborate than any cathedral in France.
So what style was the cathedral?
Pardon?
What style was the cathedral? Modern? Or?
No, it's not modern. And I just recently Googled it again, and I couldn't tell you the specific style, but it's easy to find the information.
Do you know, does somebody know there is a cathedral in the US that is modeled after Notre Dame. Covington, Kentucky. Yeah, I didn't bring it to you, but you can check it. So there are a lot of fun facts about Notre Dame.
Claire, I'd like to ask about Sacré-Cœur,
Oui.
which dominates the landscape and is also quite beautiful. What is the history or relevance of Sacré-Cœur?
It was built as a repentance after the defeat of 1870 against the Germans. So that's when it was built.
Any other questions? Well, Claire, thank you very much. I think it was great.
Thank you.